Coming up on this episode with D'Anthony Melton's $12.8 million expiring contract, now a potential trade piece. We're going to look through some potential options for the Warriors to upgrade the roster ahead of the February 6th trade deadline. Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. Hope you're all having a good start to your weekend. Happy Thanksgiving again. For those of you in America, hope you had a good day yesterday. Now, I've spoken a lot, obviously, about different trade discussions, trade conversations throughout post-game lives and other episodes, particularly in the wake of D'Anthony Melton's season-ending knee injury, ACL issue, which now sees him, unfortunately, as brutal as it is, a clear trade candidate for the Warriors ahead of the February 6th trade deadline. But I haven't spent an entire episode necessarily looking at the different options the Warriors could go through. So I've picked out 4 here that I specifically want to get into, what the Warriors could potentially give up in such a deal for these players, rank them in terms of most likely and also the best options for the Warriors. Obviously, they've now lost 3 in a row, so the opportunity to upgrade the roster and trade conversation is only going to heighten the more the team gets into a little bit of a hole here. And obviously when things are going great and the Warriors were 12-3 at one stage, it's like, okay, we don't need to do anything. There's nothing going on. We can just chill. This roster's good. But now, given the Melton injury and given the few losses and just the clear and obvious issues we've seen across not just the last 3 games, but there are concerns throughout the entire season, even though the Warriors are at a very strong 12-6 point still after 18 games. So let's get into it. I want to start with the guard position because over the last 7 games, since Melton got injured in that fourth quarter of the Mavericks game earlier in the month, the Warriors have been starting Lindy Waters III. And I've got nothing against Lindy Waters III. I think he can be a solid rotation player for a lot of teams in the NBA. I just don't think that he is a viable starting 2 guard on a good playoff team at this point of his career. I just don't think that is the case. He entered this season as the Warriors' 13th man. He was out of the rotation to start the season, got the opportunity, obviously, against the Pelicans and took it with both hands, had 21 points, was huge. I still don't wholeheartedly agree, I should say, with Steve Kerr's decision to elevate him into the starting lineup since Melton's injury. I think Moses Moody probably deserved and should have had that role, and Waters really went from out of the rotation. He was out of the rotation in the previous 2 games, that Mavericks matchup and then the one before, and then all of a sudden he vaulted into the starting lineup over a number of different candidates, whether it be Moses, probably clearly the number 1, but Buddy Hield, Gary Payton II, Pods as well. There are a lot of options, 2, 3 options for the Warriors that they could go to fill this Melton void, but I don't think anyone, and I've spoken about this relentlessly, I don't think anyone can feel the two-way impact that D'Anthony Melton was providing for the Warriors just prior to his injury, which makes it even more disappointing than what it already was for him from an individual standpoint. From a team standpoint, the Warriors are really, really struggling, I think, in his absence. Over the last 7 games, Lindy Waters III is shooting 37.3% from the floor, 34.3% from 3-point range. The Warriors are -8 in his minutes over the last 7 games, which is not great when you consider that he's playing a lot of minutes with Steph and Draymond, and those guys are leading the Warriors in plus-minus over this same period. So the Warriors 3-4 in this stretch. I just think they need to find a better solution at the 2-guard spot, but they've also got other holes across the roster, which I'll get into soon as well. All right, a couple of options here for Golden State. Obviously, Melton's $12.8 million contract can allow you to go out and look for quite a few different rotation players that you could plug in here. I think the most unlikely one, but the one that's been doing the rounds a little bit, is Dante DiVincenzo, and reuniting with him just months, obviously, after, well, it's still weeks, really. I mean, it's, a couple of months now, maybe 6-8 weeks after he was traded from the New York Knicks to the Minnesota Timberwolves in that Karl Anthony Towns, Julius Randle trade. And it's fair to say it's not going great for Dante in Minnesota. His role has significantly reduced. He's back to coming off the bench. His minutes have been down, and the shooting just has not been there at a rate that we not only saw last season with the Knicks, where he made the third most threes in the league behind Steph and Luka and made over 40% of them. Even the year before that with Golden State, where I think he shot 39.7% on reasonable volume, started quite a few games that season as well. So the role's not there and the shooting's not there. They're kind of plugging him into more of an on-ball creation role, which just isn't really his go. Like, he should be an off-ball catch-and-shoot guy who he's really like 3-and-D with a little bit of secondary ball handling and playmaking, but probably not to the level that Melton was necessarily providing. But in terms of a direct like-for-like replacement, I think Dante DiVincenzo would be perfect for the Warriors, assuming that he can get out of this funk that he was in. And I'm pretty confident he would be if he came back to the Bay and was slotted into that two-guard role next to Steph. Is it absolutely ideal? No, I think Melton's a better player than DiVincenzo. If Melton's up and running, I think he's a better player than DiVincenzo. And so maybe you'd prefer to say, okay, well, we're going to use Melton for someone else and then try and bring Melton back in free agency and have him in that spot again next season. But that's a huge risk to take for a guy that's not only now recovering from an ACL injury and surgery. I'm not sure if he's had that yet or not, but he's obviously got the back concerns, which saw him limited to 38 games last season and saw him miss 5 earlier this season as well. The other thing with this is Minnesota, 8-10, really bad start. A lot of chemistry issues there. We obviously saw what happened with the Randall Gobert situation in the game last week where they were in Toronto, a surprise loss there, and in the final minutes, Gobert was kind of pinning Scotty Barnes under the rim, had him sealed, and Randall was out on the perimeter and just refused to pass him the ball, and Gobert got frustrated, so he just lurked in the lane and got an offensive 3-second violation there, and then on the ensuing possession just committed a frustrating foul on Scotty Barnes as well. So there was that big big notable play there. And then Anthony Edwards, after the latest loss, I think, to the Kings in Minnesota on Wednesday, I believe, he was hugely critical of the fans who started to boo a little bit, said it was disrespectful as F, basically. And then he was also very critical of his own team, obviously, with Minnesota really struggling at the moment. They've lost 7 of their last 9. I think Ant called them soft as hell, called them a bunch of kids, unable to really talk to each other. Maybe that goes to show that they are missing Kyle Anderson a little bit from a leadership standpoint, but that's a conversation for another day and a conversation for Timberwolves fans more than Warrior ones necessarily. But clearly they're still going to try and be in the playoff hunt. I mean, this is a team that made the Western Conference Finals last season, had a great run in the playoffs. They're not going to want to take on D'Anthony Melton. Right? Why would they trade Dante DiVincenzo for a guy on an expiring contract who cannot play for them because he's out injured? They are not going to do that. Therefore, I did have someone in, I think, one of the post-game lives recently where we were talking about Dante a little bit, and that person mentioned, I can't remember who it was, so I apologize if you are listening or watching this, but they proposed that it could be a 3-team trade where Melton goes somewhere else, the Timberwolves get another rotation player. So I was doing some scouring on the old Fanspo trade machine, thinking, okay, what possibilities could lie here in terms of a 3-way trade that gets Dante back to the Warriors. And I couldn't really land on one because the issue with Minnesota is they're a second apron team, so they can't aggregate salaries. They can't take back more money in a trade. It makes it like, this is why the Warriors were so desperate to get out of the second apron, is because it just makes it so difficult to execute trades. And the one I've really just landed on, which I think is obviously super unlikely, but makes some sense for all parties depending on how the next few weeks go. And that is a 3-team trade with the Spurs, the Timberwolves, and the Warriors. So the Warriors would clearly just get Dante DiVincenzo. The Timberwolves would get Chris Paul, another former Warrior, and a 2026 second-round pick from the Warriors that is actually Atlanta's 2026 second-round pick, but Golden State own that at the moment. And then the Spurs would get Melton and a top 10 protected 2025 first from the Warriors. So breaking it down from all three sides, the Warriors giving up D'Anthony Melton, a second-round pick from the Hawks, and a top 10 protected 2025 first as well. I think when you look at it simplistic, in a normal scenario, giving up Melton and 2 picks for Dante DiVincenzo isn't great because, as I said before, you could clearly make the argument that I think Melton is a better player than Dante just overall in what he brings to the floor and how he fits with the Warriors as well. But this is obviously not a normal scenario. You've got a guy that is now out for the season, is providing no value to you. So you have to give up something of significant value to get off him, and particularly if you're going to get a good rotation player, a guy that could foreseeably start for you in Dante, you're going to have to give up something of value. And I think, would the Warriors do this? Would they be willing to give up a first-round pick to get Dante DiVincenzo back? I think that's what it would take. I think if you look at it from a Spurs perspective, I'm not even sure they would do it. I think they probably see Chris Paul's value as a leader and an experienced guy in the locker room as perhaps being even more valuable than like another pick in the teens or 20s, depending on where the Warriors land at the end of the season. Like, this is a first round pick for now, not 5 years down the track. If it was a future first round pick for when Steph Curry's 40 years old, then I'm sure the Spurs could talk themselves into it. But for this year, given it's a 2025 pick, I'm not sure if the Spurs would necessarily go for it. And they're also, they're over 500. They're in the playoff hunt themselves. Is there a possibility here that they're actually buyers rather than sellers? I think when Chris Paul signed that contract with the Spurs in free agency, a lot of people thought, okay, he'll start the season, he'll be a really good leadership locker room presence for them, but perhaps come the deadline, they could move him on and try and get to a playoff contending team, because we know Chris Paul's still after that elusive first NBA championship. Maybe the start of the season has them reevaluating that, and they could actually be buyers more so than sellers at the deadline. But again, this is probably going to come down to the next few weeks here and how the Spurs go and how the Timberwolves go as well, because I think if the Spurs do hit a bit of a lull, fall in a bit of a hole, and they kind of look at things and say, you know what, we're not really going to be in playoff consideration, we don't necessarily want to be or need to be in playoff consideration, then maybe a trade like this makes some sense, where you've got Chris Paul, a 39-year-old point guard who is on an expiring contract, like he just signed a 1-year deal, and maybe at that point you could be like, you know what, getting any kind of first round pick for Chris Paul would be a win and fair value. So I think it is fair value for the Spurs. It's just, do they value Chris Paul more? Like, if you put Chris Paul on the open market, getting a first round pick for him, I think is a good result. But for his value that he brings to the Spurs in terms of, again, that experience and leadership, maybe they would just prefer to keep him. But again, I think that would be dependent on what happens with them over the next couple of months here before the trade deadline. And then from a Minnesota perspective, one of the reasons they're playing Dante in a bit of a different role, where he's almost sometimes their backup point guard, is because they've really got a lack of point guard options. It's a 37-year-old Mike Conley who's just come back from injury, and it's a rookie Rob Dillingham, which Conley's injury has allowed him to kind of emerge a little bit over recent games. But I think the Timberwolves and Chris Finch would still be having significant concerns on, or not concerns, but question marks on whether Rob Dillingham is going to be a rotation player for them come playoffs if they make it that far. And so they could certainly do with addressing their point guard situation, and maybe having both Conley and Paul on the roster is a bit of an overlap and you don't need both. But I actually wouldn't hate it, because you don't want to have either of those guys necessarily being asked to play 30 plus minutes, every night, and, particularly necessarily come playoff time. You want to keep them fresh and, being able to be energized and playing hard while they're out on the floor. And it's hard to do when you're that age with so many miles on the legs. Maybe you have both of them and you can say, all right, well, you can basically essentially play 24 minutes each. Whoever's got it on a particular night necessarily, might play a few minutes more. But you've got two really experienced guys there who, Chris Paul is still a really viable, good NBA player who's averaging over 10 points, over 8 assists this season, shooting the ball pretty well again from three-point range. Like, I don't hate that for Minnesota, but I still think they would look at it and say, hey, Dante DiVincenzo, if he turns things around, he's on an incredibly team-friendly contract if he can turn things around. The only way I would see Minnesota necessarily doing this is if things continue to kind of mull away in a situation where things aren't necessarily great from a vibes and chemistry perspective, and maybe Dante voices some discontent about his role or reduced role on the team and how they're playing him and stuff like that. And maybe it gets to a point where it's like, you know what, the fit here is just not what we envisaged when we made that trade with the Knicks. And then maybe you do look at it and think, you know what, we do need another legitimate point guard rather than trying to plug Dante into this role or relying on a rookie Rob Dillingham. Maybe that's the scenario they get to again, where Dante's a little bit discontent, not happy with his role in Minnesota, voices that a little bit, and perhaps they choose to move on. But even still, doing so only months after trading for him, I doubt that's going to happen. So again, it'd be considered unlikely, this trade. Another far more simplistic one for the Warriors, a guy that we saw earlier in the week, is Dennis Schroder, who went for 31, 5, and 7 against the Warriors, and then had a pretty big performance against the Suns to follow that up as well. He's averaging 18.6 points, 3.2 rebounds, and 6.3 assists on the season on 41.7% shooting from three-point range. He makes $13 million this season. Clearly, you can just make the Melton for Schroder swap from a salary standpoint, and then it's going to be about what Brooklyn would want in return in terms of draft assets, or maybe there's a young player going their way and then another rotation player coming back to the Warriors. Who knows? But if you could do Melton and a first-round pick for Schroder, do you do that from a Warriors perspective? My question mark and an issue with this is, if you are going to be trading a first-round pick, ideally, I think it would have to be for a starter or a guy that you're at least going to plug in for 25 plus minutes a night. If you're trading a first-round pick for something less than that, they'd want to be filling a pretty specific need for you. And you could argue that for the moment with the Warriors, with Dennis Schroder, and the fact that, Pods and his form is still, up in the air, and a particularly talking point among fans. Some fans are even proposing that Pods needs time in the G League. We saw Steve go to Pat Spencer for backup minutes in Steph Curry's absence on Wednesday night. There's a need there for a backup point guard, particularly if Pods can't turn things around here in the next 15, 20 games. Dennis Schroeder's having a great season. He'd instantly become one of the best backup point guards in the league, in my opinion. I actually think he's good enough defensively where you could play him quite a bit with Steph. I don't think you'd necessarily start him, but you could definitely, I think, close games with Steph and Dennis Schroeder, particularly if that kind of takes the pressure off Steph from a ball handling perspective and allows him, again, to be playing in more of a two-guard role where he's running off screens and trying to get open that way, rather than him having to dribble the air out of the ball and then go step backs and difficult shots. And I think Schroeder could make it a lot easier for Steph in that scenario, playing alongside each other. So that's definitely a trade that I'd be interested in from a Warrior perspective. The issue is here that Schroeder's value is just skyrocketing, and there's going to be a lot of interest in him if he is available at some point before the deadline. And the way Brooklyn are going, the way they're playing recently, are they even going to be sellers ultimately? We've heard so many reports about them, plenty of guys, Finney-Smith, Schroeder, Cam Johnson, Cam Thomas, all these different guys that could be available. Well, if they keep winning games, would you just, if you were them, would you just change your perspective and say, hang on, we're actually going to keep these guys and maybe we could become buyers, and maybe we're like a genuine playoff team randomly enough, even though we just traded what was our best player in Mikal Bridges to the Knicks during the offseason. So that's going to be interesting to see, what happens with Brooklyn. But I think of all the guys that they've got, I think Schroeder makes the most sense, because it's clearly just from a salary standpoint, you're just flipping Melton for Schroeder. And the other guys like Finney-Smith makes just slightly more. So, okay, maybe you could do Melton and Guy Santos or something for Dorian Finney-Smith, and obviously there have to be picks thrown in there from the Warriors side. I just think Schroeder feels a bit more of a need for the Warriors than Finney-Smith would. And then like a guy like Cam Johnson makes $23.6 million, I think, this season. It just gets really difficult. You're talking about multiple players going out. Not only, therefore, do you have the risk of the trade, but you also have the risk of the locker room and trading like three guys out, particularly if it's a veteran guy like GP2 or Loon, guys that do bring a lot from an experience and leadership standpoint. So I don't know. I think from a Nets stand, if the Warriors were looking at any of these Nets players, I think Dennis Schroder has to be the the key one that they would target. Now, I don't think he's necessarily a perfect fit for the Warriors, but I do think he would be a good fit. I do think that the Warriors could potentially offer a first round pick here for a guy who could easily play 25 plus minutes, maybe, 18 minutes 16 to 18 minutes as the backup point guard. Steph's averaging less than 30 minutes a game this season. There's 18 minutes there that Schroder could potentially fill, and then he could potentially play, 5 to 10 minutes alongside Steph as well, potentially at the end of, the first and second halves as well. So where would that leave Brandon Pajemski? I don't know. I think it'd be a situation where he could still get, 15, 20 minutes and play alongside, again, Steph or Schroder or something like that. Maybe you'd utilize him in a different deal. Who knows? Maybe it's Melton and Pajemski for Schroder and something else. Who knows? There's so many different ways here, but in terms of simplistically, Melton for Schroder, those salaries work, and then you throw in a pick from the Warriors side, maybe that gets it done. But again, there's going to be so many teams interested in Dennis Schroder. Moving on from the guard position, a couple more here. I've spoken relentlessly about the Warriors' need for an offensively skilled big man, something different to what they've already got in the defensive ways of Draymond Green, Trace Jackson Davis, Kevon Looney. The Warriors have very rarely had guys that you could consider scorers from the big man position. And I think it's something they really need to address. I just think you just need something different, right? So a couple of guys here. The first one, again, the most simplistic, is Kelly Olynyk. So this was a report from Anthony Slater of The Athletic last week after the confirmation of Melton's season-ending injury. He said, Melton's contract attached to a draft pick might be able to fetch a capable rotation player in January or February from a team like the Raptors or Nets. So we just spoke about the Nets, Dennis Schroder. The Raptors, if you look at what they've got on the roster, again, Kelly Olynyk makes exactly $12.8 million. Right. Perfect equation there from a salary standpoint for DeAnthony Melton, just to flip him for Kelly Olynyk and bring Kelly Olynyk in. And obviously you'd have to give up a pick. Now, it might have to be a first-round pick in the process. If you could get away with 2 seconds, then that would just be a home run deal. If it's Melton and a couple of seconds for Kelly Olynyk, that's a home run deal for the Warriors. I don't think Toronto necessarily would go for that. They're probably after a protected first, top 10 or lottery protected first round pick at the very least. Again, Olynyk's a guy that plenty of teams are going to have interest in. He hasn't made his debut so far this season. He's currently out with a back strain. That probably helps the Warriors and any playoff contending teams who may be targeting him, at least from a value standpoint, and what Toronto could foreseeably expect in return for him. But if you look at his numbers last season, 9.8 points, 5.3 rebounds, 4.4 assists, shot 38.7% from three-point range. He's not a go-to scorer. He's not a guy you're going to run plays for or anything like that. But he is a guy who I think would fit perfectly on the Warriors. Just seems like a Warrior-style player in terms of, has some size and versatility on the defensive end, but particularly on the offensive end. A guy that can shoot from range, can put the ball on the floor a little bit. If guys close out to him, he can actually put the ball on the floor and not just look at the rim, but actually make plays off of that. Again, 4.4 assists last season. I just think he'd be a perfect fit for the Warriors. But again, is it enough of an upgrade to say, hey, it's worth giving up a first-round pick for Kelly Olynyk? I think the Warriors, I would potentially look at it, but I'd obviously much rather give up, a pair of seconds or something like that. Again, I don't think the Raptors would necessarily go for that. But again, with the Melton salary perfectly equating to Olynyk's salary, it makes a lot of sense. And we know it's been reported. It was reported back at last season's trade deadline. It's been reported since about that interest that the Warriors had in Kelly Olynyk, again, dating back to last season's trade deadline before he was ultimately traded from the Jazz to the Raptors. With the Raptors, it's a bit weird that they would trade for him and then within the space of a year turn around and trade him again. But that's kind of the position they're in. I think they're 5-14 at the moment. They're a rebuilding team. If they could get a first-round pick for Kelly Olynyk, I think that makes a lot of sense for them. And so we'll wait and see. He probably needs to get back out on the floor and show what he can do after this back strain. We know what he can do, but just to make sure if you're a team targeting him like the Warriors, you want to see him back on the floor and actually playing and looking like he's not necessarily hampered by that back issue at all. The Warriors have obviously just gone through that with Melton and the 5 games he missed earlier this season. So Olynyk, to me, in terms of guys that you could target at Melton's salary, I think he might be the one. I think because he could potentially be a starter, I think particularly come playoff time next to Draymond. I don't love saying that Kelly Olynyk's your starting center. I still think there's some defensive concerns there, and he's not necessarily a go-to guy offensively, but I think it's something the Warriors would probably do come playoff time. And then, if things aren't great defensively, you've still got Loon TJD there as well. I think it would allow the Warriors to, their closing lineups, they wouldn't necessarily be going super small. It wouldn't be all small ball with Draymond at the 5. I think you'd quite viably have Olynyk out there closing games. And all of a sudden, you've got the floor spacing that the Warriors want when they go small with Draymond at the 5, but you're not giving up all your size because you've got Draymond actually playing at the 4 and a 6'11" guy next to him. I think he's a perfect fit for the Warriors if they can get him. The last one I want to talk about here, because we had a report earlier today from Jake Fisher, I would say he was of Yahoo Sports. He's, I think, moved to Bleacher Report, but he's also contributing for Mark Stein and the Stein Line, and he wrote that. He had a report on Mark Stein's Substack earlier today, talking about the Chicago Bulls and particularly Zach LaVine and Nikola Vucevic. Talked about the Warriors' previous interest in LaVine, but again, he's having a good season, but his contract is just, it's too difficult for a lot of teams and including the Warriors, because they'd have to give up Andrew Wiggins as part of that trade to even get just over halfway to Zach LaVine's contract, and the Warriors are not giving up Andrew Wiggins to Zach LaVine the way that Wiggs has been playing so far this season. So Zach LaVine's not a talking point, although you could see him as another, as the go-to scorer that the Warriors might need next to Steph in the backcourt, but it's not going to happen. Vucevic, on the other hand, a lot more affordable, obviously, from a salary standpoint. And this really pricked my ears when I read this earlier, that Fisher wrote, one GM told me he would put the 2-time All-Star, referring to Vucevic, likely price point in a trade at 2 second-round picks. If you can get Nikola Vucevic for 2 second-round picks, I actually don't see, there's just not much downside to me. This is a guy that's averaging 20.4 points, 9.9 rebounds, and 3.3 assists so far this season on shooting splits of 57, 45% from 3 on over 4 attempts per game, and 86 from the free throw line. If you can get him for 2 second-round picks, so I was doing it again, went on the trade machine, and you could do like I think you could do Melton, GP2, 2 seconds for Vucevic and Torrey Craig. Now, I think, obviously, the Warriors are only $500,000 below the first tax apron, but I think because because Torrey Craig's on a veteran's minimum, I believe, he's at $2.8 million, but I think that only 2.1 of that actually goes to the salary cap, and so I believe the Warriors can still fill that in. I'm happy to be told wrong about that, but I think that trade works. Melton, GP2, 2 second-round picks of Vucevic and Craig. I think if I was not getting Torrey Craig back, that would actually make a bit of a difference to me. I know that sounds a bit weird, but giving up Melton and GP2, that's 2 defensive-minded guys that you're losing out of your rotation. But at least in this situation, you get Torrey Craig back, who, again, is kind of a defensive-minded player at the wing position. So I actually like that trade from a Warriors standpoint. I really like that deal. And then you try and bring either one of or both of Melton and GP2 back in free agency. And so if the Bulls are going to be, willing to take on expiring salary and just get 2 second-round picks for Nikola Vucevic, I don't see what the downside is. Because, again, if you're giving up a first-round pick for him, then there is the possibility of things going wrong where he reverts back to how he played last season, where he shot less than 30% from 3. We know the issues defensively. If you give up a first-round pick, as I said before, you want a guy who's going to be a guaranteed starter for you and basically guaranteed to play 25 plus minutes a night. I think Vucevic would start, Yes, but would he be playing at guaranteed 25 plus minutes a night? I don't think so. Would he necessarily be in your closing lineups? As talented as he is, he's 20 and 10 on 45% shooting from three. I don't necessarily think he would be because of those defensive concerns. And so if you're giving up a first round pick for that, that's where it can become a bit problematic and there can be a significant downside to it. But if it's 2 second round picks, the only downside would be, if he reverts to being bad again, and if he's just a guy that's averaging 20 minutes a game, then do you really want to be paying a guy $20 million next season because he's still got another year on top of this one after this on his contract? So that's going to be the issue. Is like if he just comes in and he's just not a fit for you, then all of a sudden you're not going to be able to necessarily get off his contract, and not without giving up other assets. And you're going to be stuck with a guy making $20 plus million who you don't really utilize enough for that to be worth it. And if you look at what the Warriors historically have spent on the center position from a salary standpoint, they just don't. Because they know that usually their closing lineups will have Draymond Green at the 5, right? And therefore, why would we spend $15, $20 plus million on a center when we've had Kevon Looney, who for his entire career has been on single-figure salaries every year, and then Trace Jackson-Davis we've just drafted, and we signed him to a 4-year, $7.6 million contract, like less than $2 million a year. So the Warriors historically, it would suggest they wouldn't do this trade because they just don't pay big men significant money, particularly over $20 million, like Vucevic is on $20 million. So I doubt the Warriors. Well, I don't know. I think the Warriors need some versatility at the center position. I'll keep saying it until they address it. I think they need some versatility in the front court. Like if you look at that game the other day against the Thunder where the Warriors go 9 straight possessions without scoring a bucket. Now, I think in that situation, you could actually run some plays for Vucevic in that scenario, and he can go get your bucket. Like he can be a go-to guy, right? He can be. He can do different things. He can shoot from the mid-range. He can shoot from 3, as we can see with the percentages. He can put the ball on the floor a little bit. He's got nice touch around the paint. Like, he can do a lot of things for you offensively, and I think in a situation like that, the other day against the Thunder, the Warriors could have really done with another guy that you could say, hey, all right, let's run a play for this guy and see if he can get us a bucket. It's not traditional Warrior style because they have usually, like, clearly over the past 10 years during the Steve Kerr era, it's mainly all perimeter stuff with Steph and Clay and stuff like that, Jordan Poole, KD to a certain degree as well. It's usually perimeter play from the guard and wing position, so it would be different, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it would be bad, and I think it would actually be quite helpful. So, again, if you get Vucevic for Melton and GP2 and a couple of seconds, that interests me. That really interests me. And then Olynyk again. If you could get Olynyk for Melton in 2 seconds. Tell me what you'd rather. Would you rather Olynyk for Melton in 2 seconds, or would you rather Vucevic for Melton, GP2 in 2 seconds, and you get Torrey Craig as well? I don't know. I think I'm probably being a bit biased here in terms of giving up 2 seconds for these guys, but I'm just going off the report from Fisher today that says one GM told me he would put the 2-time All-Stars likely price point in a trade at 2 second-round picks. That's what I'm going off. And so that, when I read that, I was like, oh, okay, if that's the case and the Warriors can get this guy without giving up a first, that certainly interests me. And then Olynyk, again, if his price point is a couple of seconds, that interests me. So let me know. Olynyk, Vucevic, Schroder, DiVincenzo, any other names that you think the Warriors should be targeting across the coming weeks here ahead of the February 6th trade deadline. I had someone in the post-game live as well, I just wanted to mention the other day, talking about stretch bigs and stuff like that. Mentioned Chris Boucher from the Raptors. I'm sure he would be gettable and probably for a cheap price. I think I just want someone a little bit more proven than he is, like an Olynyk or Vucevic, guys that we know have put up numbers and been really, really solid, good rotation players in the NBA for a long period. That's probably what I would be going for, rather than a guy who, yes, theoretically gives you shooting from the 5 position and does allow you to stretch the floor, but is he going to be a part of your playoff rotation? I'd have question marks on whether Chris Boucher would be, right? I don't think he necessarily would. So it's going to be fascinating because they do have this Melton salary now, which means that you'd think the Warriors will do something ahead of the deadline. But what that is, whether it's just a guy in the $10-13 million range that's making Melton's salary and it's Melton and a pick for someone like Schroder or Olynyk, or something a bit more like Vucevic, or something even greater, a guy making $30 plus, $40 plus million, we'll wait and see. Again, if you've got any thoughts on any of the players I've mentioned in this episode or want to throw any more out there, please do. If you are watching this on YouTube, please comment down below. Other than that, guys, if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POK252, that's POK252 on X/Twitter. We're on Instagram, TikTok, Golden State with mates. Warriors play the Suns tomorrow. I still might do a preview episode of that in the next 12, 24 hours or so. I'm just trying to line up, see if I can get a guest on to be able to preview that. But I'll let you know. You'll either see a preview episode or you won't. Other than that, guys, I'll probably be back for a post-game live after the Suns meeting tomorrow anyway. Hope you can tune in to that. Otherwise, I'll see you on the next episode.